Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance. In this presentation, we're going to be continuing our video series on testing physical performance, and this one is going to be on testing strength. So what is strength? Essentially, strength is just maximum force production. If we have a look at this picture here, two people pushing a ball, the person who can produce the most maximal force is going to be able to push the ball and move it in the direction that they're pushing. So maximum force production can involve different muscles, different movements, and different muscle actions that we're going to talk about later. So maximum force is not just one characteristic, it's highly dependent and specific on the muscles we use, the movements we do, and then what muscle actions we are testing. So when we're actually performing a strength test, we have a few different muscle actions that we can test. So we have, firstly and most commonly, our dynamic strength, which is going to be a combination of both concentric and eccentric muscle actions. So that's going to be our classic lifts like a squat or a bench press, for example. So we have a look at this athlete here doing a front squat. They have both the concentric and eccentric phase. So as the athlete lowers down, that's the eccentric phase of the lift. And then as they come back up, that's the concentric phase. And really doing dynamic strength tests are going to be only testing the concentric phase, because the eccentric phase is not going to limit the loads that can be used. It's going to be the concentric phase that's going to limit the loads we can use, since eccentric muscle actions can handle higher loads than concentric. So another form of strength we can measure is isometric strength. And isometric strength is essentially when we are performing a movement and trying to produce maximal force without the muscle changing length. So an example of this would be something like an isometric mid-thigh pull, which is probably the most commonly used isometric strength test. We then have eccentric strength tests, which are only involving the eccentric portion of the lift. An example of that would be a Nordic hamstring exercise, where you're only lowering yourself down and there's no regard for the concentric or isometric muscle actions. When implementing the dynamic strength tests, we want to make sure we use specific muscles or movements. So for example, if our sport primarily uses the lower body, we probably want to use some sort of strength test that primarily uses the lower body. And an important consideration is to make sure we use safe and specific rep ranges as well. So 1 rep max is pretty much the gold standard with dynamic strength tests of how much force they can produce. So 1 RM might be good for advanced athletes who are capable of doing that safely, but for athletes who haven't had much resistance training experience, maybe it's not safe for them to do a 1 RM. We can also do a 3 to 5 RM, somewhere in that range, and we can then use calculations in order to estimate a 1 rep max. And they're going to be pretty accurate. The higher the repetitions are, the lower the accuracy of predicting the one rep max. But in the 3 to 5 rep range, 3 to 5 rep max range, you should get a pretty accurate estimation. We can also use things like 10 RMs or even greater than that. Again, we can estimate a 1 rep max, but it's probably not going to be as accurate, since we're really delving quite a far distance away from that specific 1 RM movement. However, some benefits of something like a 10 RM or greater could be to measure hypertrophy progress. So if we're improving our performance in the 8 to 12 rep max range on certain lifts, that may be a good gauge that we have more muscle in order to move that weight for higher repetition sets. So isometric strength testing, again, is going to measure isometric muscle force. So how much force the muscles can produce in an isometric fashion without changing length. And these are going to be, in general, a lot safer and easier to perform for most athletes, since there's not too much technique or familiarization involved. So if we look at an mid-thigh isometric pull test, we can see all the athlete has to do is stand on this platform here, grab this metal bar and basically push down with their legs and pull the bar up as hard as possible, and that's pretty much it. So most athletes can pick this up pretty quickly, and there's no real need for any technique or learning. A benefit to isometric strength testing is that it also may be more related to speed and power than dynamic strength. I put this here as a question mark because it's up for debate, but there is some evidence out there that isometric strength may be more related to certain athletic movements, which may be more beneficial for the athletes that you're testing than traditional dynamic strength movements. However, the limitations to isometric strength testing is that it requires expensive equipment, so you're going to need a force plate, and there's limited movements or muscles that can be tested. So apart from doing an isometric mid-thigh pull test like this one here, there's not too many other movements that we can do. So if we want to isolate a specific muscle, it's going to be very hard unless we have a isokinetic dynamometer. Eccentric strength testing is basically when we're measuring maximum muscle force in an eccentric fashion, so when the muscle is lengthening. When muscles are lengthening, they can produce the highest forces. So we can measure the eccentric muscle force of certain muscles or movements at different velocities. And we can use very specific muscle actions. However, the issue is that the equipment required is extremely expensive, and it's usually only limited to laboratories. Rarely would you see it at any sports facilities or clubs. And the equipment that they use is an isokinetic dynamometer, which is this machine here. So essentially what we can do is you can set this lever here to a specific velocity, and basically the person has to produce as much force as possible while the lever moves at that given velocity. So for example here, if we have this athlete trying to extend their legs, so keep their legs straight as hard as possible while this is moving down automatically at a given speed, that will measure our eccentric quadriceps muscle force at the velocity that we prescribed. So another option here to do eccentric strength testing is the Nord board. So this is a more affordable system that can help us test eccentric hamstring strength. So the Nord board here has the athlete have their knees on the pad, have their ankles in these hooks here that measure force. The athlete will lower themselves as much as possible and get an automatic reading from this device here. So there are some more affordable eccentric strength testing options, but generally we're still going to need more expensive equipment. And as always, most importantly, make sure whatever test you use, you're using consistent and repeatable protocols. And that way we can ensure that the changes in performance that we see are actually changes in performance and not errors in our testing protocol. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.